Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Snow, and right about now, the United States is playing Russia in hockey in the Olympics. Those of you who are near my age remember the Miracle on Ice, I'm sure. I don't know how that's going to turn out this year, but I'd love to see that game, so I'm honored you're here. Thank you, Brian, and Father Steve as well for hosting this great event. I don't need to tell you what a special thing this is to have this Lumen Veritatis lecture series, and I'm really honored to be included in it. I was here last year for the Anthony Esselin talk. Were any of you at that talk? Okay, yeah, great talk. I'm sorry you were there because I'm not Anthony Esselin. Who is? He's a fast-talking, witty Italian guy. I'm a slow, thoughtful German guy. The best joke I usually get all year in my classroom is the first day of class. I tell my students, I'm not a funny guy. And they all laugh. And those are the best jokes I get. So, but I'll try and keep you awake. I think this is a great topic. I'm going to talk for no more than 45 minutes. So I've got this timer up here. And then we'll have a conversation because I'll say some things that I hope, they're not meant to provoke you. I don't do that on purpose, but I'm sure that there will be things that I will say that will provoke you and you want to talk about them. The beauty about Catholic social teaching is that it really is about everything. So it's all on the table. Marriage, family, education, economics, politics. We can talk about all of that, and we've got great food and drink to help the conversation along. So this is great. So I do see that many of you are somewhere near my age. If I asked you what's the first thought that comes to your mind when you hear Catholic social teaching, I'd be curious to know what that was. For me, for many years, the first thought was this. And I went to Catholic school in the 80s in Cleveland, Ohio, at a Franciscan high school. If that tells you anything. Wasn't Jesuit. Catholic social teaching meant Catholic socialist teaching. And what that meant was that you favor a large welfare state, redistributive taxation, most of the program of the left, and that you downplay or don't talk about what at that time were called the hip issues. The hip issues being issues involving sexual morality, marriage, life. So I was very active in the pro-life movement, and we were always trying to get pro-life events going. And the response we always got was something like, you need to combine this with an event for the poor. Because that's what the seamless garment requires, and that's part of Catholic social teaching. And there was always just resistance. And so I found myself becoming suspicious of Catholic social teaching. It just seemed like an agenda driven by an ideology. And so it was not until later that I came to see otherwise. Just briefly, that moment was actually in graduate school in the early 90s, reading that great encyclical by Pope John Paul the Great, Centesimus Annus, which is on the 100th year, published on the 100th year of what's sometimes called the first encyclical of Catholic social doctrine, Rerum Novarum. That is an amazing encyclical letter, Centesimus Annus. We can say more about it. But anyhow, what I want to tell you is that I think Catholic social teaching is greatly misunderstood today. It continues to be, I think, abused and misunderstood. We had an example of this several weeks ago. I'm guessing you follow the news. You're here, you're probably the sort of people that read around online, so you know the news about the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy for the Social Sciences, Bishop Sarando, who stated that, I'm going to quote him, right now, those who are best implementing the social doctrine of the Church of the Chinese. Did some of you read this? Did you hear about this? Okay, some of you heard about this. Okay. He goes on, he praised the communist state as extraordinary, saying, you do not have shanty towns, you do not have drugs, young people do not take drugs, instead there is a positive national conscience. Now, I find that sort of on the face of it just deeply problematic, and I'm not going to spend our time here responding directly to that claim. I only raise it to say that it exemplifies for me the kind of reckless irresponsibility that has happened at high levels with respect to authentic Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching, I'm going to argue, is at the very, very heart of what it means to be Catholic. It is bound up centrally with our very Catholic identity. It is who we are, and it is a great treasure, and it's so important for all of us to appropriate it. I'm going to make that case using Catholic social teaching. So what I have given you is a handout of some basic principles of Catholic social teaching, and I want to go through them with you and make comments on them as we go. We'll see how far we get into them, but there are some just really important points here that I think are often overlooked or not made, and I want to make those points. Thank you. And if any of you get worked up along the way, that's great. I do want to leave time for that because in part, Catholic social teaching is about discussing and understanding how to apply those principles. So those quotes, by the way, are all from this compendium of Catholic social teaching. This was compiled by the Pontifical Academy for Peace and Justice, and it's a really rich resource. It has abundant citations in it from a vast number of sources in the teaching tradition of the Church, great introduction, chapters organized on the human person, on the family, on work, economic life, political community, the environment, peace, last chapter, a civilization of love. So I just decided to pull them all from here, but some of the quotes in your handout have quotes around them because it is quoting a different document, and I've indicated where that is. So that just makes it a little more efficient for us, just to pull it all from one book. But I'd encourage you to own this if you don't already own it. Okay, so what is Catholic social teaching? Again, all these quotes are from documents within that tradition. With her social teaching, the Church seeks to proclaim the gospel and make it present in the complex network of social relations. Salvation permeates this world in the realities of the economy and labor, of technology and communications, of society and politics, of the international community, and the relations among cultures and peoples. All these quotes, you're going to have to let them sink in a little bit because they're really rich. We just commemorated the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, you may know. And the core issue in the Reformation theologically was the issue of justification. Catholics usually aren't raised to focus on justification. We're thinking about the Incarnation, the Trinity, marriage. You know, we've got this big picture, but for Protestants, if you know any, it's justification. Like Luther is, we stand or fall on the doctrine of justification. And if you know about Luther's doctrine of justification, it's a view of imputed righteousness. It's a forensic view of justification. Christ justifies us by substituting himself for us and covering our sins. In justification, we are not made righteous. We are just declared righteous before God. So that's the core part of the doctrine. They do have a doctrine of sanctification that's next to that, but it's secondary. It's justification. Catholics, if you read about justification, make very clear justification is to make us holy. It's called theosis. That's the technical term. The point of the Paschal mystery is to sanctify the world. That's a different way of thinking about it. I mean, you can focus narrowly on Christ died to save us from our sins, to undo the effects of the fall. But if you look more deeply at what the documents say, God's plan from the beginning of the foundation of the world was to sanctify us and to sanctify the world. So when Catholics are thinking about our spiritual lives, it's about sanctifying all these aspects of the world, which is why Catholic social teaching extends from the gospel. The good news is a good news about grace in the world. Does that make sense? So Catholic social teaching is just an elaboration of how we do that, of the principles governing that. So in truth, although some people talk about Catholic social teaching as originating with Rerum Novarum, this encyclical letter of Leo XIII in 1891, that's a conventional starting point. We can talk about that letter if you wish. It was largely written to address the problems of industrialization, what was called the social problem at the time. But the fact is that Christ is already dealing with Catholic social teaching. It's in Scripture. It's in the Church Fathers. They're deeply concerned about political structures, economic structures, marriage, family, how we are living our lives together. So Catholic social teaching touches everything. Number two, all these points are interrelated. If you pull any one of them out, you'll miss something very important and not even understand the point that you're trying to understand if the other one is missing. That's true for point number two, especially. The legitimate autonomy of temporal matters. For by the very circumstances of their having been created, all things are endowed with their own stability, truth, goodness, proper laws, and order. Man must respect these as he isolates them by the appropriate methods of the individual sciences or arts. What's this principle saying? Here's a shorthand for it. One of my favorite passages in St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae is this. Grace does not destroy nature. Grace builds on nature and perfects it. I'm just going to repeat that. Grace does not destroy nature. Grace builds on nature and perfects it. Nature is God's first grace. So all of the natural order and the things that grow out of it, and I mean nature in terms of trees and rivers, the physical nature, but also human nature. When we are sanctified, we don't stop becoming human. We become more human. In Christ, we become more what we are. Grace doesn't abolish that nature. We get some students at Hillsdale College from Protestant backgrounds, and they take Christian theology to require that, in some sense, grace becomes a substitute for the natural order, so that at some extreme you even have Christian math. I tell them, I don't know what Christian math is. Like, I know what math is. What would Christian math be? Math is just math that you can do in a very Christian way. Christian music. So there's a way of like slicing off parts of nature and calling them the Christian thing, when in fact, what we're called to do is bring Christ into all of those things, not dissolving them. So that what this means is biology has its own relative autonomy. Economics has its own autonomy. There's not such a thing, I don't think, as Christian economics, but there's a way in which Christians should do economics or politics. So our job as Christians, this call in Catholic social teaching to permeate the world with salvation, does not mean to absorb or destroy those things. It means to bring grace into them and perfect them. So this, again, is going to become important in some of the issues that we talk about this evening. Number 3, principles, not blueprints. Respect for the legitimate autonomy of earthly realities prompts the church not to proclaim specific competence of a technical or temporal order. The church is very clear about this. Bishops, the Pope, clergy, Christians have no special claim by revelation to understanding physics. Scripture is not a manual on how physics works, or economics, or carpentry, or music, or math, or whatever else on this. The church is not trying to direct Christians in some other way. The church is not trying to direct people in these relatively autonomous arts and activities. It gives us principles. But the application of those principles, the church leaves, as we'll get to this in just a moment, to the laypersons. I'm going to go to that right now. Before I do so, let me just say this. I think that one of the abuses of Catholic social teaching that has occurred has been when Catholics have identified Catholic social teaching too tightly with a very specific policy recommendation. A recommendation that might be very complicated and might allow for legitimate disagreement on that application. And so when someone in the church sort of authoritatively ties Catholic social teaching to a particular kind of public policy or doctrine that ends up not being accurate, maybe a claim about a complex economic issue like raising or lowering interest rates. I mean, economists even don't understand how the economy works. That's notorious, right? Their predictions are always wrong. So if you say, well, Catholic social teaching requires us to keep interest rates down in order to keep inflation in place, or say from rising or something like this, whatever the theory might be, the church squanders its own authority because it doesn't understand, it doesn't have the expertise to speak out on those sorts of issues, and so it loses some credibility. So I think we need to be very careful about overclaiming what the doctrine teaches and requires. Okay, number 4, the lay vocation. It belongs to the laity to seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and directing them according to God's will. This is actually straight out of Lumen Gentium. I believe this was the first document that was produced by the Second Vatican Council. The most central, sort of revolutionary part of that document, Lumen Gentium, was the chapter on the lay vocation. And what the Council Fathers were addressing was a history of what is called clericalism. And clericalism is a confusion over the respective roles and responsibilities of laypersons and clergy. So in the history of clericalism, one of those misunderstandings was that only priests are called to be holy, only bishops are called to be holy. If you want to be holy, you've got to become a priest. Laypersons are kind of second-class citizens. So what Lumen Gentium declares is, no, there's a universal call to holiness. All of us are called to holiness. And that wasn't a new teaching, right? If you've ever read St. Francis de Sales' Introduction of the Devout Life, this beautiful, rich, spiritual reading, that's de Sales' point. My point is it's not a new teaching, but it had really not been emphasized. And so the council really wanted to take on this clericalist view and remind laypersons of their high vocation. So clericalism can manifest itself in different ways. One of the ways that we sometimes see today is, well, if you want to be holy, you got to work for the church. And by working for the church, that means maybe you're really Christian if you're involved in, say, the liturgy. You're reading the readings, you're helping in the sanctuary. The more you're acting like a priest, that's really the more Christian you are. And there's a confusion in that direction. The council says we should all participate in the liturgy according to our respective roles. I'm raising all these points so we can talk about all of these during the Q&A. A second expression of clericalism sometimes happens when clergy attempt to direct laypersons specifically into the activities in the secular world, how to vote or act with respect to politics or economics or these other matters. And the documents are so clear on this. This is our vocation. I mean, this talk is for you. I mean, the church makes very clear in its documents, the responsibility for the application of social teaching belongs to the laypersons. They have the call, they have the anointing from God to bring this into the world. Every layperson is anointed as a priest, prophet, and king, not ministerial priesthood, but we are anointed as priests at our baptism, and it is our job to know this and to bring it into the world, obviously with humble appropriation of those principles from our teachers, the clergy. But the application, that's our responsibility. Okay. Number 5, holiness, not activism. The inner transformation of the human person in his being progressively conformed to Christ is the necessary prerequisite for a real transformation of his relationships with others. When I was in high school in the 80s, there was a very strong theological movement within the church known as liberation theology. You may remember that, you may be familiar with it. It grew out of Latin America, and this theology was eventually reined in pretty strongly by John Paul the Great and Ratzinger and then Benedict XVI. But the liberation theologians were coming dangerously close to reinterpreting Catholic social teaching in secular terms. That is, it was coming dangerously close to conflating our responsibility to be active in bringing charity into the world as almost a substitute for the interior personal conversion, that primary central feature of the faith without which there is no faith. If interior conversion is not the foundation of Catholic social teaching, then Catholic social teaching simply becomes an ideology. It just becomes an ideological program and not something that's growing out of the life of grace within the church. So the church calls us to that call to holiness in the liturgy. So important for us not to forget this. I think that we have a real danger, especially in this country, in two directions. And we see it today. One direction is reading the life and fate of the church too closely into the political events of our time. That happened in St. Augustine's time. If you remember, the church, the Roman Empire was Catholic. After 4 centuries, violent persecution, etc. Now you have the whole empire, it's Catholic. And then the barbarians come and sack Rome. And the Christian community, the church, is just demoralized and at a loss. God, why would you let this happen? And Augustine writes one of the greatest works ever in theology, the City of God, precisely to tell them heaven is where that gospel is completed and perfected. That's our end goal, is heaven. And do not attach yourself too much. Yes, you're called to sanctify the world, but don't attach the affairs of what's going on in the world too closely to God's divine plan. I've got a nephew. He's 18. He loves Donald Trump. We can talk about Trump here. I'm fine with that. We have to be able to talk about this, okay? And not. I have deep reservations. I'm not. I voted for him. I'll tell you the truth. But I have deep reservations about the man. You can read some of my pieces online. I've been very critical. I'm very worried. Just being forthright, I'm not saying that you had to vote for him or not vote for him. That'll be a point that I'll make. But he was comparing Donald Trump to St. Paul. And, okay, he's 18, so I'm giving him, he's a spirited young man. But I said, John Paul, you can't do that. Just can't do that. You can't, and he's a faithful kid. He loves his faith. But I said, this is scandalous because it's a superficial comparison that trivializes your faith. Like to compare St. Paul, think about St. Paul. The passion, the dedication of that man who became a martyr for the faith and brought it to the Gentiles. It just trivializes that message in that man. And it makes an idol. It risks making an idol of the political present. So, but on the other hand, notice the title of this talk. I'm calling it the Catholic Option. And maybe you noticed what I'm alluding to in calling it the Catholic Option, because I think the other tendency, contrary to making too much of politics, is a kind of preaching of the abandonment of politics. And so you may be familiar with Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. That's what I was referring to. And it's a lovely book. It's got a lot of good things in it. But I think that there's some real dangers in that book. And there's one line in that book where someone claims that the Benedict Option is really just a great expression of Catholic social teaching. And I don't think that is. And I'll give you the reasons why as we keep going. But I think one of them is that politics is a field which God has made and ordered for us to live with and interact in. And we cannot and should not abandon politics even when times are dark. So there it is. I'll get to that point in just a moment. Number 6, the dignity of the human person. Okay, now we're getting into the more concrete teachings of Catholic social teaching. This is the heart and soul of it. This is every document we read, they say, the point of I'll read it. The guiding principle of all of the Church's social doctrine is a correct view of the human person and of his unique value. Now that's a great line. That's from Centesimus Annus 11. So get your anthropology right. You've heard this before. As you understand the human person, so will all your actions and policies and politics go. So if you're not basing your policies on a true understanding of the human person, then those things are going to be false insofar as they're based on that premise. What is the true understanding of the human person? I have to put this line here because this was John Paul II's favorite line. I love John Paul II, if you didn't notice. I quote him all the time. Teaching 2 sections of the theology of the body at Hillsdale College right now to 60 students. It's the 5th time I've taught it. Students just eat it up. And half of them are Protestant students. They're hungry for this stuff. And I have memorized, like basically the first day, GES 24, say it. GES 24. Gaudium et Spes 24. Here it is. Man is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself. That's the first half of the paradox. Like he didn't will us as a means to something else. He willed us for our own sake. And cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. So that's the other side of the paradox. He willed you for your own sake, but you cannot become yourself unless you give yourself away, unless you can really make a sincere gift of self. That's the whole measure of every social institution and practice. Does it respect persons as ends? Does it assist them or thwart them in the ability to make a gift in themselves, in their marriages, in teaching, in schools, in professions, in their leisure? Does it make self-gift more difficult or easier? There's the measure. It almost comes down to that. Okay. I could talk more about the human person. Maybe we'll have a chance to do that. Religious freedom, number 7. We're not going to get through all of these, obviously, but I put my favorite ones up near the front, so that won't be a problem. You can read the other ones on your own. Send me an email if you want to talk about them. Religious freedom. The effective recognition of the right to freedom of conscience and religious freedom is one of the highest goods and one of the most serious duties of every people that truly wishes to ensure the good of the individual and society. This is so big. Prior to Christianity, politics and religion were one in every culture. The political authority absorbed and was an expression of the theology. So Christianity, and this is true for Judaism, right? I mean, God institutes the laws of his people. The political and the theological, although the authorities are somewhat distinct, are part of the same unified order. Christianity radically changes that. My kingdom is not of this world. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Give to God what is God's. Suddenly we have a distinction between the order of theology and the order of politics. And this is a very difficult and problematic distinction, and here's why. Because both of them make the highest claims on us, right? I mean, theology, if it's true, is about the whole structure of reality. It's the source of meaning for our lives. But politics also sometimes demands the last measure of devotion from us. We celebrate Veterans Day, right? We honor our war heroes. Sometimes citizenship in a political regime demands our very lives. So we've got two kind of orders that are making comprehensive claims on us, and they're always going to be in a little bit of tension. And what I want to emphasize here is that the distinction that comes with Christianity of the theological order from the political order becomes the occasion for a more dramatic separation, or it's not even more dramatic, it's just part and parcel of that separation, is the emergence of what we today call civil society. Think about what happens when the space for theology is opened up. The things that happen within the church, so hugely important. Hospitals, schools, universities, orphanages. You could go on. The initiatives that were not, the government didn't do those. Those weren't initiatives of politics. Those grew from inside the life of the church. So there, in religious liberty, are the seeds of a whole vision for political and social order. So the subsequent points we're going to make follow, in some ways, from the fact of this principle of religious freedom. So you go to number 8. By the way, I mean, this is an interesting point. I ask my students this: when was the first political law providing welfare in the West? That's a rhetorical question for you. The first welfare law was instituted by Parliament at the direction of Henry VIII. Why did he do it? Because he'd closed down all the monasteries, seized all the religious property, and suddenly you had a vast number of the poor that had no one caring for them. So that is when the state first assumed the responsibility for the poor. For 1,500 years prior, the Roman Empire didn't have welfare for the poor. I mean, it did have redistributive political programs for political reasons, but they didn't have the kind of care for the poor and vulnerable that was found in the Christian tradition. The church was overseeing and implementing all of that activity. I think it's important to remember that in this day and age when we assume that all of that must be the role of the government. It's not the case that that has to be. It can be, but it's a conversation that we need to have. So we look at the common good, number 8. According to its primary and broadly accepted sense, the common good indicates the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. It's a lot of ideas there, but what I want to highlight is that in this understanding, the common good is a set of conditions. And this is especially the common good that the political authority is meant to preserve. It's not to make people improve in their welfare directly. The real emphasis is on creating the conditions under which people can achieve their own development. So who does do the actual work of development? Well, that is the obligation of people in civil society. That is what the church says. I'm going to skip number 9 just to go to 10 quickly to highlight this point. Catholic social doctrine, okay? I mean, boom, boom. Solidarity, subsidiarity, the 2 S's. They're like symbiotic twins or something, like Siamese twins. You can't separate them, but they're distinct, and you've got to have them both. They kind of mutually enforce one another. So subsidiarity is the one that often gets forgotten in the discussions about Catholic social teaching. So the principle of subsidiarity must be respected. A community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its function, but rather should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view to the common good. So a higher order should not interfere in a lower order, but should only assist it. Now, the principle of solidarity above it emphasizes our responsibility to work for the common good, to collaborate with others, to help other people. But subsidiarity says that the role of government is not to do that work, but to assist others in doing that work. My point is that what Catholic social teaching envisions is a picture in which there is a space in which we are the engines of good. The point is to enable us to build our schools, to build our associations, to build our businesses, to work in our hospitals. That is the way in which we engage in the world. And that government has a role to structure those relations, to make sure that persons are respected, to create forums for making contracts, having property, these sorts of things, to make sure that the moral conditions are in place so that people are not led into behavior that's contrary to their dignity. If there's an emergency, the principle makes clear the government should step in, but it should never simply replace that order. What does that mean, in fact? Well, I mean, just a kind of proposal might be something like this. Human development requires education. So the government might have a very legitimate role to play in ensuring that every citizen receives an education. But it doesn't mean that the government has to provide that education. If people were not spontaneously providing their children education, this was the case in the late 19th century. Children, a very valuable economic commodity. 6-, 7-, 8-year-olds are working in the factories. You know the stories, to help the family economy. So schooling laws were passed. Mandatory schooling laws, are those legitimate? I think in some circumstances, yes, they are. But that doesn't mean that the government has to provide the schooling. Can't we imagine a way in which government could have a mandatory schooling law, use its money, instead of delivering that education, giving that money to parents to build their own educational institutions and direct them and manage them. That is certainly a possibility that is, fits well within the kind of vision that Catholic social teaching gives us. I am not saying that public schools are bad or contrary to Catholic social teaching. I just want to be clear about that. I think it's more complicated. That these are prudential judgments, but I think that there's plenty of space in the documents for this. Number 11, the family. I'm just going to go a few more minutes here. I don't know that I need to say too much about the family here, but because it is so important, I will. The importance of the family for the life and well-being of society entails a particular responsibility for society to support and strengthen marriage and the family. Civil authority should consider it a grave duty to acknowledge the true nature of marriage, that is marriage between one man and one woman, that is permanent, indissoluble, monogamous, and the family to protect and foster them, to safeguard public morality and promote domestic prosperity. Now, I think this is not only important for Catholic social teaching. If you look at the data, which in the social sciences, it is almost perfect in its consensus that the single greatest correlation variable that correlates to human flourishing is the structure of the family. So you can look at risks for abuse, for poor outcomes in education, risks of drug abuse, risks of sexual abuse, risks of illegitimacy, risks of emotional, mental instability, and the strongest correlation, poverty, is family structure. That variable has the strongest correlation. And it's not just family structure, there's a consensus. I'll give you the data on it. Look at the National Marriage Project. Just go to the website of the University of Virginia, which I need to remind you is a secular university. It's not a religious university. It's a state school, University of Virginia. In the sociology department, not known for being conservative as a discipline, there's a National Marriage Project. They just collect the data in the sciences, and then they publish the summaries. And there's where you'll see this. The biological family, intact biological family, what they mean is a family in which children are raised by their biological mother and father is the gold standard. That none of the other arrangements come close to what it does for helping human beings to flourish. So we're in the midst of just a radical experiment in our culture, aggressive ideology. It's been here a while. Right? It was the pill and the sexual revolution in the 60s. It was the divorce revolution, no-fault divorce revolution in the 70s. It was the gay revolution in the 80s. It's been the pornography revolution in the 90s with internet pornography. 2000s, of course, same-sex marriage, and now we're in the transgender revolution. And each one is just like a huge wave building on the one before it. And these have caused incredible disorder and chaos in our culture, and we need to this demands our full attention. 12, maybe I'll finish on 12, or I'll finish on 13. That's as far as I'll go, though there are other great points along the way. Politics. Political authority is and must be a positive and irreplaceable component of civil life. In Catholic social teaching, political authority is willed, it's part of the natural order willed by God. Romans 13, obey those who put in political authority over you. God wills political authority, and He wills our participation in it, insofar as we are able. This is one of those areas within the world that we should be bringing Catholic social teaching. So I'm really worried when voices tell us The cultural war is over. We lost. Politics is futile. Retreat to your private community and rebuild it from the ground up. I think that's profoundly wrong and dangerous. If, for one reason, if you don't bring it to them, they will come for you. If you haven't noticed, they're not going to leave us alone in your small community. I just came from a bioethics conference at the University of Hillsdale College. It was yesterday and today. The conference was organized exclusively by students. One of the keynote speakers, Dr. Ashley Fernandez, you should bring him in. MD, PhD, Georgetown University, PhD in philosophy, devout Catholic, one of 5 boys, 3 are doctors, one's a priest. He is on the board of trustees for the Ohio Right to Life Society, and he is also the director of bioethics for the entire Ohio State University College of Medicine. Now, this is a guy, so I've had students go through the Ohio State University College of Medicine to become doctors. They've been mentored by him. They're going out into their practices, bringing the church's teaching on natural family planning. They're teaching life. They're bringing it into those institutions. Here's a guy who is in the secular world, courageously bringing the truth about the human person. The second speaker is a philosophy professor, Christopher Tollefson at the University of South Carolina. Another secular institution. He's been a stout defender of the natural law, marriage, family. He's married, he's got 9 children. Had the chance to spend a year with his family at Princeton in 2011. Those 2 didn't get the message that the war is over. Either did the students. We need to be ready to go out. We can't say that the battle is over. It's not true, and we can talk about this, but even if it was true, we're called to be witnesses. We're called to go out and speak the truth to that authority and confront their consciences. So, something to talk about. I'm sure I'm going to get some people that maybe will disagree with me on this. Last point, economics. The church's social doctrine considers the freedom of the person in economic matters a fundamental value and an inalienable right to be promoted and defended. The church's social doctrine, while recognizing the market as an irreplaceable instrument for regulating the inner workings of the economic system, points out the need for it to be firmly rooted in its ethical objectives, which ensure and at the same time suitably circumscribe the space within which it can operate autonomously. It's a long phrase. This is the point I want to make. It'll be my last point, then we can have Q&A, talk about whatever you want. All these encyclicals, in one way or another, pretty firmly condemn socialism. They're pretty clear about it. It's in the compendium. You can read in the compendium a firm denunciation of socialism is directly incompatible with Catholic social teaching. You also find a denunciation of the social assistance state. What you find, so Sorando's endorsement of China, I mean, just on the face of it is baffling. There are lots of other, I think, the plight of Catholics in China is horrible. The underground church and what they've suffered is amazing. And for him to say that, I think, is just the height of irresponsibility or just fatuousness about what's going on there. But what I want to emphasize is that when it comes to economics, the church, in its teaching in numerous places, commends capitalism, but what it says is better called the free market, which I think is right, because I think capitalism is maybe not the same thing as the free market. So it wants to say, look, the market is, the teaching says that the market is an irreplaceable instrument for the efficient allocation of resources. It encourages private initiative. It allows people to cooperate and provide things for one another, etc. But the market is not a god. It should not be autonomous. It is something we make, and we need to make it as Christian believers. It's a neutral system in a way that will be as good or bad as the buyers and sellers that participate in it. We may want to talk about economics a bit more, but this is the plug I want to make about it, is this. Economics is not, participating in the market, buying groceries. It's not a practice that is likely to, it's not a practice that people are going to write novels about. They're not going to write lyric poetry about buying your groceries. This is humble activity. And it's not the noblest activity. It's not ignoble, but there's nothing noble about exchanging money at the cashier and taking your groceries. This is low in the sense that it relates to what's necessary for our lives. It's not heroic activity, but it's good activity. And we need to understand and be able to affirm the goodness of those sort of just ordinary, necessary activities. And I think the market takes a lot of abuse because it's not heroic, it's not where the heroic, super generous, self-giving sharing goes on that we admire so much. But we need to be very careful not to look askance at those necessary and low activities that are part of that order God has given us for our flourishing and happiness. So how the free market is going to fit into the big picture, again, that's a question that we can discuss, but I'm out of time. I'm done. I love your questions. Thank you. You've been very patient.